Good morning. Welcome to our class together again today. I'm glad that you joined us. We are continuing our study in the Synoptic Gospels. Today we're focusing on one particular chapter of the book of Matthew, a unique chapter, one in which the material is only found in Matthew. Three very popular parables that remind us about the end of time and making diligent preparations. So that's what we're going to look at today as we do that. As we do, I wanted to ask you a series of questions as we get started. The question is very simple, but I'd like to ask the question this way. In this situation, what would you do? Suppose you live along the Gulf Coast of Texas, and life is pretty good, and all of a sudden, though, you get a warning on your phone that says there's a hurricane coming. A tropical storm has strengthened quickly, and it's changed course and it's headed toward your town. You have a day to get ready to do something about it. What do you do to prepare? Second scenario. You live in Northern California. You're up in the hills. It's a beautiful place. You love it. The problem is a knock comes on your door one night. There stands a firefighter who says, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the fire has changed course. The winds have picked up. We don't know what's going to happen, but you may have to leave within an hour. So make whatever preparations you need to make." What do you do to prepare? Now, one with a little bit less sinister connotations. Your son graduated from high school in May. And now it's August and it's time to pack up the car and take him to college. What preparations do you make for that moment? All of those scenarios are interesting because you have to ask the question, what preparations do I make for things like that? It may be as dangerous as a hurricane or a fire, or it may be something as innocuous but very emotional and a big life change, such as sending a kid off to college. Now, I could have brought in several episodes that we could talk about today. What happens if you have an older parent and they need care? What do you need to prepare for to care for them? What do you need to prepare for before you get too old and you have to pass along your estate to your children? All of those are interesting ideas, but all of them require some measure of preparation. So what do you do in order to prepare? Well, I want you to answer that question for yourself, but just a few hints from me. You always look at the fact that this has to happen sometimes, and you've got to be ready at a moment's notice. You have to think about what you're going to do, what you're going to take, what you can sacrifice. I tell you that because one of those stories is a real story for me. There was the first one about a hurricane. Vicki and I lived on the Gulf Coast for 17 years. And there was one year. I remember this hurricane. It was supposed to go under the Sabine Pass near the Louisiana-Texas border. But all of a sudden it changed course. And it began to bear down on the Galveston coast. And it went from a Category 1 to a Category 3 in the space of 2 hours. Suddenly it looked like things were going to be terrible. And in fact, we had lived in a house for a year, a brand new house. We had built it from the ground up. And you don't think about things like that until they happen. And suddenly I had to make preparations. I spent a small fortune for plywood that was not any good. I wore out saw blades trying to cut the thing to size so I could board up my windows. And then once I was as tired as I could possibly be, I've never been that tired in my life, I went back in and I said, "Okay, folks, we're going to have to leave here in about an hour." We had a small car and I said, "We can't take everything. So take what we're going to need," and everybody gets one treasured possession. My wife decided she wanted the portraits that were taken when our children were the age of 2. My youngest daughter had a tent that went over her bed, and that was her cherished possession. She wanted to take her tent. My oldest had a doll that she would not part with, and so she took it. I took a briefcase with all the checkbooks and the bills and the insurance policies. I'm the practical one in the family. But we didn't have that much time to think. You had to know what you were going to have to do when you needed to do it ahead of time. That's true about this lesson as well. And so we're going to focus on the idea of making preparation. And we're going to do it because Matthew has a unique emphasis on it in a single chapter of Matthew chapter 25. So let's take a broad look at these parables today. Let's just look at them for a moment. Let's just examine them. We're well known, but let's go through them again. And I want to ask you the question. I'm not going to answer them, but I'm going to ask you the questions to answer for yourselves as we go through these. So let's read them together. The first is Matthew chapter 25, 1 through 13. It is the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. We know the story. We know that the background is that in the ancient world, a wedding feast was a party that was kind of called stump the guests. And the star of the attraction was the bridegroom. And the bridegroom could delay as long as he wanted to see if he could catch people unaware, because that was part of the joy and the fun. If you go to the Middle East today, you can find the same kind of thing happening. People roaming the streets waiting for something to happen, and it may take weeks before it happens. It's a very common idea to the time of Jesus. So let's read it. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oils in the jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins awoke and trimmed their lamps. But the foolish ones said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both of us and you. Instead, you go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were already with him went in with the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others came also. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour." Let me ask you these questions. Just answer them for yourselves. What does this parable tell you about preparations and about making preparations? When you look at this story, why do you suppose the foolish virgins didn't bring more oil with them? What were they expecting? And what did they discover? And what about the wise ones? Were they being selfish and not sharing their oil with their sisters? It's an interesting story. Think about that as we go forward. Let's go to the next story. Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. The parable of the talents. Now, just by way of clarification before we start. A talent is not an inborn ability to do something. It's not a developed ability to do something. It's not like a talent like playing a musical instrument or being able to speak in public. That's a whole different idea. This was a measure of money. There was a certain amount, certain weight of money. That's how they measured worth. And from what we can tell today, a talent, if you brought it up to today's prices, one talent was worth $1.5 million. We're talking about a fabulous amount of money. And one of them gets a lot more than the others. But it's a fabulous amount of money. More than these men can ever know. With that in mind, let's read the story. Again, it would be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went out on his journey, and the man who had received 5 bags of gold went out at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid the master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you have entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with few things, so I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you have entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you were a hard man, harvesting where you had not sown, gathering where you had not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid the gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. You knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then, should you not have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest? So take the bag of gold from him, give it to the one who has 10. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What does that parable tell you about making preparations? Why do you think that last servant did what he did? Why did he hide it in the ground? And so think about it this way. At least he didn't lose anything. He returned his master's money complete. Why was the master so upset with that? At least he didn't lose the money. Why was he punished for not hurting anybody in this whole scene? Interesting questions. And now the last parable. Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. What we call the parable of the sheep and the goats. Just to remind you about sheep and goats. They look very much alike. They sound very much alike. But they're not anything alike. Sheep were worth a lot more in the ancient world than a goat. A goat eats grass along with sheep, but a sheep puts out things such as wool, which are valuable in the spinning of wool itself. They provide necessities goats don't. With that in mind, let's read the parable. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. And I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't invite me in. I needed clothes, and you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't look after me. They also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you? He will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. What does that parable teach you about making preparations? Does it seem fair that just because you didn't notice, you're getting blamed and condemned for just being unaware? After all, we usually say, did they know what they were doing when they did that? No one in this parable knew what they were doing. They just did things. How come both being so unaware but acting so differently got so different a result? And were the people who didn't help, were they really evil or just unaware? Interesting question. Now let me ask you one more. Of these images, which gets your attention most and which repels you, and why? Now, I don't know about the last one. I can't really speak to it, but the first question, I think I have a preference, and I'll share mine. You have yours, and you share your own. The one that gets my attention the most is the second one, the one about the talents, because it's something that seems to be so easily grasped for us, that we all have things in life, that we all have moments in life, and that we will use them for good or for not. We will benefit others or we won't. Now perhaps they're all three the same. Perhaps they each have a different spin. But we do know this. All of them talk about getting ready for a moment in time. So how are they similar? Well, a lot of times you look at things, and if you look at similarities and differences, you get to understand them better. So let's look and see how they're similar. Number one, they all involve groups of people. Just think about it. There are two sets of virgins, the wise and the foolish. There are three servants. There are two groups, the sheep and the goats. These are all categorizations. These are all separating out people into two categories. And Jesus doesn't mind letting the categories speak for themselves. You're wise or foolish, you're prudent or you're imprudent, you're aware or you're not aware. Secondly, there's this time of waiting that is in all three of them. First, we wait for the bridegroom to come, and he is delayed, and so you wait and you sleep at night, and suddenly, at the most inopportune time, he comes. The master has left, and the servants do not know when he will return, only that he will. Or you have the sheep and the goats, the last day. We don't know how long their lives have lasted, or how many years have passed, or how many centuries have passed for that matter. But this is the end of the waiting. We also know that what is done before affects the consequences later. If you bring extra oil, or you don't bring extra oil. If you invest what the master has given to you and get more, or you don't. Or you are aware and help those who are around you without knowing who you're helping, or you don't. What is being done today is what's going to affect the later. And the other is people are seen as negative or positive depending on their preparation. Just think about what's being said. You've got wise and foolish. Which would you rather be categorized as? You've got prudent and wicked. That's what he calls that last servant, the parable of the talents. You wicked, slothful servant. Is that what you like to be called? See, it's negative for them. Sheep and goats. Would you rather be a sheep or a goat? All of those things point to something that are always about what God wants us to do in preparation. What do they and us need to do in order to prepare? What do they need to prepare for? That's an interesting question. When Jesus talks about those three parables, he's talking in a context. First of all, the big context we've already looked at. The book of Matthew is written to Jewish people. And so it has this very Jewish flavor, this very Jewish slant on things. It is expressed specifically to Jewish people to get them to believe that Jesus is indeed the King of the Jews. We've seen that for the last few weeks. So what does this say to those people? The context, the immediate context, is from Matthew chapter 24. In Matthew 24, there's this curious question that is asked by the disciples. They were sitting on the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives sits and it overlooks the city of Jerusalem. There are many pictures you can see in which you see the city of Jerusalem today with the Dome of the Rock, all the things there, but they're always taken from the Mount of Olives. It provides a wonderful panorama of the city. They're sitting there looking at this panorama of the city, and in the midst of that is the great temple built by Herod the Great, the replica of Solomon's temple. It is the crown jewel of Judaism. And everybody who comes there admires it. So the disciples are sitting there, and it's their private, and they come to him and they said, "Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, there's a lot of stuff balled up in that. One thing is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple that will occur in 70 AD under the hand of Titus the general. And in that one, it will be a bloodbath. The city will be destroyed and people will run for the hills. In fact, one of the things that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24, you will need to flee to the mountains. And we know for sure that that's exactly what happened. They fled to Masada, which was this mountaintop fortress built by the Herods as their retreat. So he handles that. And the temple is going to be destroyed, which was a very important motif for Jesus, the temple being him. The temple will be destroyed. The physical temple will be destroyed, not to be built again. The real spiritual temple will be destroyed and resurrected, be brought back to life. So there's one question. When is that going to take place? And then the other question, which is, when is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Remember, the disciples may not have had the best theology at this point. They may have figured the end of the age was when the Son of Man, the Son of God, would come back again. And it is, but they were probably expecting it to be a different kind of coming. And so Jesus explains this, and he's asking the question, are you ready? And out of that, you find three things in Matthew chapter 25 that point to what the need for readiness is. In Matthew 25:13, the end of the first parable, the parable of the virgins, therefore, he says, keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. There's going to be this suddenness, this abruptness. We've heard of the comparisons. The comparisons were going to be made to, it is like a thief in the night, or it's like a woman with labor pains that come on upon her suddenly without expectation. You don't know when it's going to happen. So you've got to keep watch. You've got to pay attention. You never know. But the second thing he says is in verse 29 and 30 at the end of the parable of the talents. And it gives us a glimpse at what will happen when the day comes. For whoever has will be given more, and they'll have it in abundance. Whoever does not have, even that will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You hear that coming. He said, there is a day in which those who have made the preparations will be given even something greater, and those who haven't, they'll have the only thing they've got left taken from them, meaning their life. And you have that second point, which leads to the third point, which is at the end of the parable of the sheep and the goats. Then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is not temporary. This is eternal. This is the last time. This is going to be permanent. And whatever you have done in life, this will become your permanent state after that. There's no second chances. There's no do-overs. There's no waiting period. There's no punching your ticket until maybe you get good enough to where you can make the advance upward to the right place. There's heaven and hell. Plain and simple as that. He's saying, though, that there's something more important than the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple that's going to happen. And that is the last day. That is the day in which every man will give an account for his life and his soul, and he will be judged by God based upon the life he has lived on earth and the response he has made to God and to Christ. It's very, very basic for us because we've read the end of the story. But for them, they were going, but the worst thing that could happen is for us to lose our nation. And Jesus says, phooey with the nation. The worst thing to happen is to lose your soul. And what's interesting is that the Jews have been unprepared for his first coming. When he came, they didn't recognize him as Messiah, especially the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees. But most passed over him as another one of those who came as a would-be Messiah, touting his own power and working some sort of pseudo-miracle. He was dismissed. The question that Jesus asked here is, will you be ready for the second? Now I want to point out one small thing here. When Jesus talks about hell, he's not talking about the libertine or the profligate. He's not talking about the axe murderer, the serial killer, the rabid thief, the sex trafficker. He's not talking about any of those people. Now, they may be included, but understand, he's talking to good Jewish people who've lived good Jewish lives, but they have ignored Jesus and what he has said to them about what they need to do with him. The good don't go to heaven. The obedient believer goes to heaven. So be prepared for the moment. So what does Matthew teach us about these preparations? Let's look at a few things together, just as observation. First, without watchfulness, there's always going to be danger. We don't know when things are going to happen. We really don't. And it's easy to grow complacent that it'll happen sometime, probably not in my lifetime. And so far, in my lifetime, it hasn't. That doesn't mean it won't. What about my children, or my grandchildren, or my great-grandchildren? I don't know. All I know is the possibility exists every day the sun comes up. So you got to be watchful. The coming is going to happen, and you're aware and you're prepared. But the second thing is that preparations are personal. No one can make them for you or share them with you. The story of the virgins is very clear. The foolish virgins should have brought enough oil. And when they came to the wise ones and said, give us some of yours, they can't do that. There are a lot of people that they want to bring to the throne of Christ in the end. I was raised by godly parents. Well, good for you. Or I went to church and I've got the faith of the preacher and the elders, and I've been faithful to what the church has taught me. And he said, well, what about your faith? Where do you stand? Well, I'm part of this bigger group. I said, I don't want to know about the bigger group. I want to know about you. You cannot go to heaven on someone else's coattails. You have to do your own work. It's kind of like what Abraham Lincoln was supposedly said. He said, I don't care how tall your granddaddy was, you got to do your own growing. That's true about the faith too. We don't prepare by letting somebody else believe for us. But the third is that the enemy is to believe that you have plenty of time. We believe that delay means never. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's the most detrimental thing to do. There's a story told about the devil going to his demons and saying, I would like for you to come up with a way that you can destroy faith. So after a few days, he asked each one to come and give a report. The first one comes and he says, I have decided the best way to do it is to convince men that God does not exist. He calls the second one in. And he says, I have come to the conclusion, though, that the best way to convince men to destroy mankind is to persuade them that hell doesn't exist. And then comes the final demon, who comes in and he says, I have nothing like that. All I want to do is convince them that there's plenty of time. There's plenty of time. The first Roman emperor who was a Christian was Constantine. Constantine has strange ideas. One of them was that you had one free cent after baptism, so make it as close to your death as possible. So he was going to delay until he was on his deathbed. Well, one day he got sick too early. In fact, he wanted to be baptized in the Jordan River. He had this elaborate plan in which he was going to take a chariot down there on his deathbed and they're going to baptize him in the Jordan River and he was going to die. He was going to be ready to go. Problem is he got sick. And he was almost dying. And so they rushed him over to the church in Constantinople and immersed him there because he thought he had plenty of time. But it also tells us that what we use today prepares for tomorrow. See, it's not just a focus on tomorrow. It's not a focus on the end of time. It's not a focus on the second judgment or the second coming and the judgment. Yes, we talk about that. Yes, we discuss that and we make a big deal about it. But what Jesus says is you really want to know what's going to make the difference in, it's what you're doing right now. What's going on today in your life that's getting you ready for that day. Don't look at what's going to happen at the judgment. Look at what you're doing today as if it were the judgment. Because every day is a judgment. And finally, we prepare with every moment, even if we don't recognize it. The greatest shock in these parables comes from the goats, who say, we didn't notice that. We didn't know that. If you would have told us, we would have done something about it. Jesus never comes up and waves a flag and says, I'm Jesus. Instead, he puts on rags. He begs for goods. His stomach growls. He sits in a cell. He has a hospital bed. And he's waiting for someone to care. So many people pass by the Jesus in life that they won't recognize him in eternity. I am meek and lowly in heart, he said. I'm easily overlooked. And so every moment and every person we meet, if we treat them like Jesus, we will have done well. If we meet the needs of the people we meet, we are preparing for the day. So we've come to a close. What do we have to say about making preparations? These three parables are, any of them could take weeks to mine the gold out of. I always feel bad in these lessons because there's so much more that needs to be said, much more to be explored, much more to be thought about. But because it's a single lesson, this is what we do. So what do we glean from this? First of all, do you live your life as it is the day? You know, the problem with living a long enough time is you begin to take each day for granted. What do you do then? You shouldn't. It might be the last. Let me give you a day. The day's July 9th, 1992. I know the day. It was a lazy summer day. I was going to do routine things that day. My mother called at 6:30 in the morning. She said there's something wrong with Ann. Ann was our 2-year-old niece, the daughter of my brother. She called 30 minutes later and said, she's gone. She died. All she had was a little stomach bug, the kind that every kid gets, throwing up a little bit, not feeling well. They discovered after her death that she had a congenital disease, one that was untested for, but could have been, had they only known. And because she got sick with a fairly routine childhood disease, she died from it. It was the last day. Every day is the last day. But the second thing is, do you live your life as a steward or an owner? You know what the truth is? The truth is we don't own any of this stuff in our life. We've only been given it to mind. Stewardship has nothing to do with what happens at the collection plate on Sunday. It really doesn't. We have so warped that concept that way. Instead, it has everything to do with how you live your life every day. That God gives you something, a life, a family, goods, a spirit. And he says, I'm giving these things to you to care for like I would care for my own. That's what a steward does. Do you care for life as if God were going to care for it? You do. You're prepared. Thank you for being with me today. Next week we'll continue our study as we go through the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus from the perspective of Matthew. So thanks again for being with me, and I'll see you again next week. Have a great day.